Ross, you've written a really interesting article. It's available up on your website called Is There Life After Debt? And it's about your take on the current U.S. debt situation and a possible solution for it. And given all the talk in the media and by economists, I want to start off by asking this. Is there any way of knowing just how much debt is too much debt?
As concerned economists have watched the U.S. debt to GDP ratio soar for years, they have frequently raised the question, is there such a thing as too much debt? Well, there is. And the means of calculating it have been in the public domain for 30 years. The late Dr. Vern Attrell discovered the mathematical relationship between debt and the ability to generate GDP. He wrote about it in a book published in 1979 entitled How All Economies Work.
Okay, can you summarize it in a sentence or two? Mathematics not being my strong suit.
I can show you visually what the relationship is. Here is what we call the Attrell solvency curve. On the bottom, we measure solvency, which for countries is simply defined as the ratio of total debt to GDP. On the side, we measure the ability to generate economic activity, which for a country is its GDP. I've put a pointer on the graphic to show where the U.S. is today.
Okay, in simple terms, what does it mean for the U.S. today?
At the top of the curve is the ratio of maximum efficiency. It takes about $1.45 of debt to generate $1 of GDP. For almost 100 years, the U.S. operated at just about that precise ratio. Then Ronald Reagan came into office, and Alan Greenspan took over as chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve Board. The Republicans began a regime of cutting taxes, but not cutting spending, strapping on more and more debt as they went. I now need to add two solvency breakpoints to the Attrell curve. The first occurs at just below 2.0, which Dr. Attrell termed a first-order insolvency. That's where the U.S. was when Bill Clinton came into office. The U.S. dollar had been falling for years, and everyone was very concerned about the amount of debt that the U.S. had racked up. Clinton had the political courage to clean up the balance sheet of the U.S. government. The U.S. dollar soared, and the U.S. was on top of the world, an economic and military powerhouse that had won the Cold War and appeared to be unstoppable.
That's a long way from where the U.S. is today. What happened to change all that?
What happened to change the very positive path that the U.S. was on were those hanging chads. The U.S. elected George Bush, the biggest tax-cutting money spender ever. Worse, Greenspan allowed the banking sector to run amok in its lending practices. Every time that the U.S. was even modestly threatened with recession, Greenspan slashed interest rates and pumped credit into the banking system to prevent one. The result was that the U.S. debt to GDP ratio soared. Now, it seemed to work beautifully for years. Greenspan even earned a knighthood for beating the business cycle, but at a terrible price. He allowed the U.S. national balance sheet to be trashed. It has now fallen to a level that I show on the Attrell curve as a second-order insolvency, where it now takes more than $3.50 to generate $1 of GDP.
Is this really as bad as it sounds? What happens now?
In very practical terms, what this curve now tells us is that the U.S. is carrying over $31 trillion of excess indebtedness, over and above what it actually needs to support its current level of GDP. A second-order insolvency carries with it a unique mathematical meaning, which I can summarize by saying that the marginal productivity of debt falls to zero. You can stack on all the debt you want from here on in, and nothing much happens in terms of growth. It's kind of like strapping a backpack with 75 pounds of rocks on Kobe Bryant of the LA Lakers and then asking him to do layups in a big game. It isn't going to happen. The same thing applies to the U.S. Growth of the GDP just is not going to happen from here on, except for that related directly to government spending.
Sounds serious, but how can you be sure of all this?
To find evidence that that solvency breakpoint really works, just look at what happened to Japan, which reached exactly the same solvency ratio back in 1996. They have done nothing about their own debt problem, and their GDP has not grown one whit in all those years. The private sector, Households and corporations have been mercilessly squeezed under that load of debt, and both have been steadily withdrawing from the economy. Total Japanese corporate debt has fallen by over a third during that period. Their stock market has done even worse. In the third quarter of 2007, when the U.S. reached that precise ratio, the U.S. economy hit the wall and went into its tailspin. The question facing the U.S. government today is, shall they emulate Japan and try to borrow and spend their way out of the problem? The Japanese electorate may be patient, but I can't see that Americans are going to put up with high unemployment and zero growth for a decade or longer. Obama is already slipping badly at the polls. And if the U.S. is not back on a growth track, which it cannot be, the Democrats will be toast. Even if he survives the next election, my guess would be that the Democrats will be annihilated in 2016.
Well, if the U.S. administration's on the wrong track right now, what should they be doing instead?
The question of what to do about all that debt now becomes crucial. If you think that Kobe Bryant plays better without those rocks, then let's take a load off the poor man and let him go to work.
What does that mean for the U.S., though?
If the U.S. could take steps to remove that excess debt load, very positive things would happen. Look at the gap between the current level of GDP and the potential level of GDP on the Attrell curve. If the U.S. was not carrying so much debt, its GDP would be roughly 20% or so higher than it is today. If that were the case, the U.S. would not be suffering an official rate of unemployment of over 10% and a real rate, which includes those who are discouraged from working, of nearly 20%. The U.S. administration has got to take that debt load off American backs. It's killing them.
Well, I see your point, but how do you get rid of $31 trillion of excess debt?
To get rid of a debt load of that size, you have to start at the main source of the problem, government indebtedness. Everything else will flow from there. It isn't that other sectors aren't also extended. I estimate that households are carrying something in the order of $5 to $6 trillion of excess debt. And we know where a lot of that debt resides, in the real estate market, in which an astonishing percentage of mortgages are underwater. For the banks, I calculate that they are carrying 10 to 12 trillion in excess leverage. Small wonder that they got into so much trouble when the economy hit the wall.